Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your patience. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to tonight's program. We're going to hear from leaders in the field of artist foundations who are at the forefront of inventive approaches, including and beyond traditional stewardship of an artist's legacy. Before I turn things over to our moderator, sorry, I want to invite you all to another program we have that relates to artists' legacies. On Tuesday night, we are showing a screening of a film called Viva Varda about the artist Agnes Varda. And it's in conjunction with an exhibition that's up right now at the Fahey Klein Gallery. So that's Tuesday, April 2nd at 7:30 p.m. And now I want to give you a little background on our 5 brilliant panelists before turning it over to our moderator. Yona Backer is a creative strategist working in the field of contemporary art and philanthropy at the intersection of social justice. Over the course of her 25-year career in the arts, she's worked as the director of the visual arts at the Americas Society. She co-led the grant program at the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, and she's the founder of Third Streaming, an interdisciplinary art space in downtown Manhattan dedicated to experimental and socially engaged art. In addition, Third Streaming oversees the Alvin Baltrop Trust, including the Baltrop Legacy Projects and Archives. She also has consulted for artist-endowed foundations, such as the Lambent Foundation and the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation. Anthony Huberman is a curator, writer, and the artistic director of Giorno Poetry Systems, a nonprofit organization founded in 1965 by the artist John Giorno, where artists, poets, and musicians reflect on the work of other artists, poets, and musicians. Previously, he was director and chief curator of the Wattis Institute for Contemporary Arts in San Francisco, founding director of the Artists Institute in New York, curator at the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, curator of Sculpture Center in New York, and director of public programs at MoMA PS1 in New York. Kéwé Lô is the founding director of Black Rock Senegal, where she's worked ever since it opened in 2019. She's been responsible for developing the infrastructure of residency management, overseeing artist experiences and programming, and spearheading cultural initiatives. Black Rock Senegal, founded by Kehinde Wiley, is a unique place for creation and dialogue, and Kéwé hopes her work continues to support artists and creative initiatives for community building and creative collaborations. She's also a trained dancer who studied at Olivier Dessert and modern dance at the RADC International Center for Contemporary Dance in Paris. Elizabeth Smith joined the New York-based Helen Frankenthaler Foundation as their founding executive director in 2013. Prior to that, she was the executive director of curatorial affairs at the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, chief curator and deputy director of programs at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, a curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art here in Los Angeles, and she's curated, published, and lectured widely in the visual arts and architecture, organizing exhibitions on the work of artists including Uta Bart, Lee Bonteque, Jenny Holter, Toba Kidori, Carrie James Marshall, Donald Moffat, and Kathy Opie, and on topics in architecture such as blueprints for modern living, history and legacy of the case study houses, and her most recent essays are included in the publications Observations, Women in Art and Design History, and Action, Gesture, Paint, Women and Artists and Global Abstraction, 1940 to 1970. Tonight's panel is moderated by James Bewley, who served as the Senior Program Officer at the Andy Warhol Foundation in New York for the past 15 years. Bewley works closely with board and staff to administer the Foundation's annual grant program, which provides programmatic support to art-centered organizations, museums, and curators around the country. During the pandemic, Bewley was central to the program department's efforts to make emergency funds available to artists through an expanded network of re-granting partners. He's also a performing artist, writer, and podcaster, and my secret idol. I inherited his job when he moved to the Andy Warhol Foundation, so I'm very grateful to James Bewley. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming this incredible panel to the stage. Thank you.
Idol status. I love it. I love it. How are we doing? Good? Feeling it? This is a curious group. Because every time I explain what I do for a living, it takes a little while to my family. And 15 years, still have to explain what's going on. But you guys are ready. You want to hear about it. So that's exciting. Thank you, Claudia, and thank you to the team here at the Hammer. Thank you for welcoming us. Some of us are major funders, so what choice did you have, really? But those of us who are funders and who fund artists do so in the name of artistic legacy. And whether that's because of incredible foresight or an abundance of generosity or merely a broadly worded will, we are all fortunate to be in the positions that we're in a place where we can continually ask ourselves, what do artists need, and how can we move things forward? I have a little regret about the name of this panel, and I approved it, so I have to be okay with it, but it's some, and maybe we'll get into it at some point, but it gnaws on me a little bit. But anyway, the fact is that a whole new generation of artists are considering their legacies in innovative ways. Some of those ways look a lot like the old ways, but many are succeeding not just in creating impact. That's like what a meteor does, right? And so that's kind of where I have the problem, because what happens... Anyway, most of the artists now are thinking not just about that, but also about how to sustain impact and how to create something that lasts beyond them, that also inspires other artists. Just as they might have been nurtured and supported from a community, so too are they able to give back to communities and make sure that artists have similar opportunities that they did. So we have a solid panel here with deep experience in the field and at multiple stages of development. And rather than have each of us give a 10-minute presentation on what it is that we do, and then we're out of time, and then we have some more coffee and cookies, I thought what we'd do is just get right into it and kind of unpack as we go, and we can all talk about things that way. Because the work that we do, and it is work, like artists' legacies stuff requires a lot of work. There's often a lot of stuff, and then what to do with that stuff, and then how to manage it. It's complicated, it's challenging, but the work that we do is a marriage of personalities. It is sometimes multiple personalities, but there's the artist who is inspiring the legacy, or whose legacy it is, and then there's those of us who have to interpret how to make that legacy relevant to the current moment. And it's in this space of this space that is a fertile space, a generative space, sometimes a litigious space, as it turns out, that I want to start and kind of and go and build from. And I want to start just from a word, because all of us have websites with our foundations. Maybe we should probably have apps or some kind of AR visual helmet or something. But we all have these websites, and all of the websites have quotes, which have been carefully selected, and some of those were up on the screen earlier, right? And it's like it sums up perfectly the artist or the mission that we do, or it's some, in Kehinde's case, it's a very lengthy, earnest talk about connecting to Africa. Anthony, you have a kind of quotidian observation about the world from John Giorno. Helen Frankenthaler has this very to the point, be inspired quote, like a no-nonsense, you will be inspired by this. Andy has hundreds of pithy observations about the world. Yona, you had one from Albert Einstein, which, okay, I mean, you're kind of bending the space-time continuum in what you're doing, so we'll accept it. But if we could just go around first, and because, thinking about this place where we intersect with that work, if you could give me one word that speaks to your approach or the work that you do, and then we'll go through and unpack that. But if you can just think about one word. For me, and it speaks to why I'm not a fan of creating impact as a phrase, but the word that I would use, responsive. And so, Kéwé, We're going to start with you. From Black Rock Global Arts Foundation, specifically Black Rock Senegal, which, as we said, a project established by Kehinde Wiley, where you're bringing artists from all over the world to be in residence and to connect to the complex environment of Dakar. What word would you choose?
Hi. I will choose relationship, relation.
Okay, solid. Yona Backer, I know this could be tough because you have multiple hats that you're wearing. You're actively advising people on their legacy through third streaming. You work with Denniston Hill, a residency upstate New York that's a collaborative multiple artists' visions. You also work with the Alvin Baltrop Trust and ensure that really building of that legacy. What word would you use to talk about your approach?
Collaboration.
Collaboration. Solid. Anthony, in your case, picking up the legacy of connection and community and programming as part of Giorno Poetry Systems, or Giorno Poetry Systems, you represent an organization that is simultaneously the oldest and the newest. What word would you choose?
I think I would say people.
Okay. I'll take it. Elizabeth Smith, the foundation benefited from having Helen Frankenthaler involved from the beginning, but you've expanded the work that the foundation does with environmental grants, with grants to scholars and young curators, print donations. Your word choice.
So I think the word I would choose is one that Helen Frankenthaler herself used
Sneaky.
quite often, which is freewheeling.
Freewheeling.
And I think that characterizes our approach as well as something that she thought about.
Wow. I like freewheeling in association with artist foundations because that is like not something I would necessarily put together with it. That's great. All good words. Like I said, we have a great panel. These are good words. So let's then sort of talk about why that is. I mean, you gave us a little preview there, Elizabeth, but that's okay. We'll talk further about it. And just to give you the example and to give you time to think about it. So for responsive as my choice, as we approach the 40th anniversary of the foundation, we have tried to establish a grants program that is always following where artists are headed, where artist practice is headed, and to be there for that. So if independent artists were not being supported and needed some professional development, we were there in terms of the forming of creative capital. We recognized that arts writing was critically under-supported in the field, so we established an arts writing grant. We saw that work around the country was happening at an almost like cellular, invisible level by non-incorporated, non-501c3, never going to be a 501c3 activity, artists making work in basements, parking lots, garages, what have you. And so we established a regional regranting program that can then, which is now operating in 36 cities, that can support that very emergent, amazing work that's happening. So that's why I choose the responsive. But let's go back through and Kéwé, relationship. How does that speak to the work that you're doing?
Yes, so Black Rock Senegal is a residency program. That's a space in Dakar where we welcome and gathers people from different cultures, generation, practices, backgrounds, and people get to come together, connect, spend time together, and approach relationship to each other in a different way, I think, through the time and the space they create and they dedicate to their practice. There is a lot of dialogue, collaboration, encounters in the city, with the different artists in the community. So it's really creating this community, bringing people together and bringing them to exchange and share their knowledge and get inspired by the different experiences there.
And how has the community response been to having artists come in?
It has been, I think, a very transformative. Sorry for my English. I'll try my best to be comprehensible. But like the fact that people come and bring different ideas, discourses, approach, really awake a lot of ideas and thematic that are wide, that brings people to connect to that, to rethink what they're doing, to challenge also themselves in some of their practice. And it has been very interesting. So coming from that, we start to develop more and more programming that will reinforce these exchanges. And I see that the community and the artists are both like benefiting from this experience. So it's very impactful for the community and for the artists as well.
Great. Yona, collaboration.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, I wear many hats, one of which is working with the Alvin Baltrop estate, where, you know, when I started working with the estate, nobody had ever heard of him. And it was really thanks to Douglas Crimp, who had been introduced to the work and who ended up writing a editorial for the Art Forum, and Art Forum deciding to put one of the images on the cover, which kind of kickstarted the whole journey that we embarked on. But there's no way, without resources, without name recognition, without market value, that we would have gotten where we are right now, and we still have a long way to go, if it hadn't been for collaborations with individuals, with institutions, with curators, with writers, all kinds of people who early on came on board. You know, Leah from Participant in New York, Douglas Crimp, who I've mentioned, Noah Koshbin from the Watermill Art Center, and all these entities who early on I collaborated with and continue to collaborate with other people. And it's through those collaborations were really expansive and enriching, that with when I say no resources, zero, except for the work, we were able to, you know, get to where we are now. And then, you know, at some point, Gallery Buchholz came on board, which is also a beautiful collaboration. And so I think it's those relationships and people and institutions who see the work and believe in its importance that, you know, we've been able to achieve what we've achieved because we are not an artist endowed foundation. And having worked for the Andy Warhol Foundation, I know what that means.
It's different.
But we're at, you know, I'm at the complete opposite end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And so without the support of people in terms of the collaborations, you know, I think I would have given up.
And for people who might not know who Alvin Baltrop was, could you just briefly let us know?
He was a New York-based photographer who you know, photography was his medium. He was really an artist who was most active during the 70s and 80s, primarily on the west side of New York, the piers. For those of you who are familiar with the Whitney Museum, Whitney Museum looks out on where Pier 52 used to be, and David Hammons now has a piece there called Day's End. That was where Alvin Baltrop spent a lot of his time, not just photographing, but actually spent time there in the early 70s through the 80s when they were demolished, really documenting what was happening there in terms of artists, as well as many of, for lack of a better word, you know, marginalized teenagers who came out, who were kicked out of their homes, the whole kind of gay scene that was happening there. It really was, in the 70s, you could be arrested for being gay in New York. We tend to forget that. And it was home to many people, as well as a place, you know, kind of a playground for others. And that was where also Gordon Martha Clark had his day's end, and it created, from an artist standpoint, these really dramatic contrast between light and dark. And so this body of work that we were left of, he did more than that. He was essentially a downtown photographer who was also documenting the gay rights scene. Stonewall, Marsha P. Johnson, his portrait of Marsha P. Johnson has been shown a lot at this point. New York street scenes, and also the Navy period. He was in the Navy 1969 to 1972. There was work that he made prior, but his mother, who was very religious, destroyed it because it had a lot of nude photographs and also documentation of the civil rights movement, which unfortunately she destroyed. But yeah, I forgot what your question was. Did I answer it?
Just who was Alvin Baltrop? I think we got there. Yeah. There's a lot with it. Anthony?
So the work is really striking.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And you're bringing it to light, which is amazing.
In collaboration with many people.
In collaboration,
Yeah.
yes. Thank you for bringing it back.
Yeah.
Anthony, people?
Yeah, I thought of that word, I guess, in the context of, the conversation that happens, or that potentially can happen also this evening, around this question of artist foundations, artist legacies, artist estates, which, oftentimes, sometimes, is very much rooted, or a lot of the conversation oftentimes is taken up by the fact that there's artwork that's part of it, right? An artist passes, there's a huge amount of objects to maintain, to take care of, to put out in the world, just to think about how to continue that. And in the case of the organization that I am a part of, it's a little bit different, where it actually was not a foundation that was started upon an artist passing, and therefore he leaves behind a series of objects that then have to find a way to exist in the world. But it was an organization that the artist himself started back in the 60s that was not necessarily connected to the objects that he made himself, but what started with a mission of his interest in trying to come up with different forms of support, different ways of supporting the work of other artists, other musicians, and other poets. And so in that sense, kind of how the work of the foundation is about people, not as opposed to, but maybe in addition to objects or artworks that John Giorno might have made at the time, or has left behind as well. But I guess I chose that word because what strikes me as particularly compelling personally around GPS as an Giorno Poetry Systems, as the nonprofit organization that John founded, was again we talked about relationships, we talked about community, this notion of like, how can I as an artist try to create forms and create ways in which community building can happen between each other. How can artists kind of show up for each other as people, talk to each other, learn from each other, kind of bump into each other, and what are different formats and models and forms where those interactions can take place. So that's kind of how I got to that word.
And one of the main assets that you were left with is space, right? So you have an event space that is in a former YMCA building in the Bowery.
Yeah, it's interesting because he, during his lifetime, didn't use that space as an event space. That was kind of a new, but the space, yeah, there's a public space, which is a pretty extraordinary one. It's the very first YMCA in Manhattan was built in 1886, and it's directly across, for those of you who know downtown Manhattan, it's across the street from the new museum on the Bowery. It's if you go by there next, it's this big, huge, strange red brick building. And the Bowery was a rough neighborhood back then, and was for many years. And in the 40s, they gave up. and it was left abandoned. And then, yeah, it started to be moved in. Artists started moving in, and Mark Rothko was the first to move in and took over what was the gym of the YMCA to make the famous Seagram paintings there. And then John Giorno moved in, and Linda Benglis moved in and is still there. William Burroughs moved in, and when Burroughs died, John bought his loft, and so that loft is the event space.
Which also has the William S. Burroughs bedroom.
It also, yeah, when Burroughs died, John somehow really wanted to preserve one part of the loft, which is the bedroom. So the loft was changed around and turned into his own not living space, but John lived on the 3rd floor, which is another space that we have, but into kind of a, but the bedroom was kept in this really strange kind of house museum style. It's not a house museum, it's literally a house bedroom museum, because it's just the bedroom. It's just intact exactly as Burroughs had left it.
One of the most unnerving places I've ever visited. I mean, worth it almost just to see that, but
I think the word Burroughs and unnerving usually go together.
yeah, yep, they're linked. Freewheeling.
So freewheeling.
Okay.
Well, as I said, Helen Frankenthaler used that term herself, and another one of her favorite terms was let her rip, which I think is great. But for our foundation, to me, freewheeling
okay.
makes sense
Yep.
because we began with a pretty traditional model. I mean, we started in that place where back in 2013, after we received our bequest from the artist's estate, we were pursuing the legacy stewardship, according to, the conventional ways, a catalog raisonné project in the works, collection care, loans, opening our archives to scholarship, things of that nature. But over time, we have evolved and sort of moved pretty far away from some of those beginnings into areas where, which seem very far removed, several steps removed from the artist's own interests, certainly, and from our own concerns when we began. In part, we could do that because she left a pretty broad mandate for the foundation. She set it up back in the 80s, but it wasn't to become active until after her death, and she died in 2011. So the mission or the mandate that she established for the foundation was to promote appreciation and understanding of art. Well, that's a pretty broad mandate. I think it's similar to the Warhol Foundation's mandate, right?
It was just to the advancement of the visual art.
Right, so that leaves you a lot of room to do what you need to do to achieve that. So,
And thank goodness.
yeah,
I mean, it's
right.
really helpful.
Right, for sure. So we've really, over time, as I said, we've meandered in different directions. And, so from things like initial support to Helen Frankenthaler's alma mater, Bennington College, we took that, and we still support Bennington College, but we've gone in different directions with our support to museums of all kinds, university education. We support MFA and PhD scholarships, one of which is at UCLA, and our Prince program for university museums came out of that, grew from that interest. And the Hammer is one of 20 museums to date that we've been able to support through our Prince initiative. So it's been something where we have felt sort of empowered to go in different directions. But it's not an either-or situation, it's been a both and. And I think that's fairly typical of a lot of artist-endowed foundations these days, I would say.
Well, I think staying on that same line of thought, there's often the work that we do is aligned with an artist's wishes, and sometimes necessarily it evolves and starts to move in some of the ways that you're talking about. And I wonder for the group, what are your thoughts? And Kéwé, you have an artist who is still around, so it's a different equation altogether. But at what point is it no longer helpful for the artists who are not there, but to consider their wishes and to be like really locked into what they may or may not have wanted? Does that make sense as a question?
Can you repeat the question?
I was saying sometimes what we do is very aligned with the artist's wishes, even when it's broad like that. but things evolve and we have to change and we have to maybe move into different areas. And so what are your thoughts on using the artist as a reference point, but also is there a point where that's no longer helpful?
From the beginning until now, we've constantly evolved and moved into a different direction. I would say really the idea is a residency program, but that really sculpted itself regarding the artists that we are welcoming. We are always re-questioning the model, the practices we have, and we've been so much informed by the artists themselves, and it has been the driving line for us to change things and shift things, because we really want to find the best way to support each of them in their very particular practice and approach. So from what he originally created, the residency, also with the time, with the context, the reality of the country. Senegal is one of the most prominent artistic scene of the continent. Our very first president, Léopold Sédar Senghor, was a writer, poet, and he really put culture as the pillar of the development of the country. But throughout the time, the institutions start to kind of being abandoned, and the artists are autodidact a lot. So independent has to take over and set the foundation to keep the artistic scene being dynamic. So when we start as a residency program, quickly, by being anchored in the territory and in the community, we realize that the work we have to do is way beyond that, is way more bigger, bigger. So we're always growing, because we are actually an institution that has a responsibility towards the community. So it's always evolving and changing.
And do you feel like that comes from Kehinde's directive or his hope for what's going to happen, or that's just naturally evolving as the program evolves?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that his experience as an artist really shape the model of the residency itself in what we provide to the artists, what kind of experience we want to share with them. It really is the foundation of the residency program. But I think also our team, we have a team of artists as well that are managing the program. We are pushing it also to be very impactful in our community in Dakar.
And for both you and Yona, because you've both worked with residency programs, why do you think that's a kind of familiar strategy for artists and for artists thinking about their legacies to be involved with? And maybe what are some of the successes of that? Of all the different variations that could happen, residency comes up a lot as something that is, I'm thinking also of Titus Kafar's Next Haven, which is a Val-challenged residency program in New Haven, Connecticut, for artists and curators. There's the Joan Mitchell Foundation has a residency. Robert Rauschenberg Foundation has a residency. I mean, it's a kind of a go-to thing. Why do you think that's so popular? And also, are there some successes, I think, both with Denniston Hill, I'm thinking of, for you, Yona, and for Black Rock?
Yeah, for us in Senegal, I would say space is really where everything can emerge, starts. That's where the community can come together, like can be created. That's where you can develop your practice, expand it, professionalize yourself. So where you are in a country where there is very few opportunity to have access to that, you know that you will start by what are the needs. Like, it's important to think of what is the context and what is missing, what are the needs to reinforce, strengthen, and accompany the development of the scene. And on the continent lately, there is more and more residency program that has been created by different artists in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Morocco, in South Africa. Because, yeah, I think that's really what can expand the communities, to have a space where you can really, like a territory that you can live in and create.
I think in the case of Denniston Hill, for those of you who are not familiar with it, Denniston Hill is a residency program located in upstate New York that was founded by Julie Meritou, Paul Pfeiffer, and Lawrence Chua. And really, it started as a place where Julie, Paul, and Lawrence used to go to themselves to kind of, as a place to regenerate, restore, and rest, because they found in their experience with residency programs that there was always this pressure to produce, pressure to engage with the public, and exactly what artists needed, especially if they've gone through a period of intense production or that you need time to just rest. So that's why, Julie started first making her first large-scale paintings upstate. Paul, if you've seen his show at the Geffen, one of the pieces there was created at Denniston Hill. And they didn't go there to create their first large-scale painting or this piece that Paul created. They came there because they needed a place to rest and restore. And you don't really have places like that as artists to go to. And so when I initially came on, I'm now on the board, but when I initially came on was to help create a sustainable model for them, because initially they wanted to extend this experience to their artist friends. And then it was like, well, we wanted to extend this to the larger artist community, and I say artist in the broadest sense, because we have writers, musicians, multidisciplinary. It's really a interdisciplinary residency program. And one of the first things I did when I came on board was to do a kind of, very informal survey with former residents. And the two things that everybody said, because it was far from a perfect experience, there was no money, the farmhouse was kind of falling apart. But what people said was, they didn't have to apply because it's a nomination, and this is a curated residency program. We're really looking for particular kinds of artist practices. It's very much rooted in a liberatory practice. And B, that nothing was asked of them. And I have to say, I've now been involved for 8 years. It's a 20-year-old initiative. Is that when artists come up and you don't ask anything of them to do, they always end up doing something. That's what artists do. But there's no pressure there. And so this is their legacy. It didn't start out as a legacy. It started out as a kind of a very generative generosity. Like, we want to offer this to our friends. And then we want to offer this to other artists. And then, that's when it was like, well, who are the artists that we want to extend this invitation to? And it's really artists who are involved in a certain kind of liberatory practice. Mm-hmm. And so there's very much about conversation, informal conversations, and a certain type of experience. And I think that is now something that they're very conscious of, that is their legacy, but it didn't start out that way. Right. And I think context, what you were talking about, it's really about context. In Senegal and other places, there are fewer opportunities, whereas in New York, or the area of New York and even beyond, you know, there's so much pressure put on artists all the time. Even when they go to a residency, you got to produce, you got to produce, you got to produce. And this is the complete opposite.
Right. And really born out of the artist experience
Yeah.
that are involved
Yeah.
with it. Anthony, I'm thinking here in LA of something like Mark Bradford's Art and Practice, which moves kind of in a very lateral way and involves the community and is actively pursuing opportunities to give back to the community and involve them. And community is such a big part of what you're doing with Giorno Poetry Systems, bringing people together in person in that funny space next to Burroughs' weird bedroom. Has it been successful in, like, are you finding new communities are coming out? Is it the community that was involved with Giorno Poetry Systems before that is then reconnecting, or how's it going?
Yeah, I mean, first thing, I mean, I think I also should point out that the event program is actually just one portion of what the organization does, right? There's a record label, there's a series of phone numbers, there's some, in the future, some small grants. There's a range, because it really is about different systems of supporting artists trying to support each other. And events is one of those ways, gathering people together. Yeah, I mean, going back to this question around, I think the way that you put it at the beginning of it's on us to try to interpret this mandate, or I always like using musical metaphors and kind of read the score. You know, like if there's an intention or a mandate or a mission. I mean, I think all mission statements by definition are scores, right? And they establish a certain series of priorities or a certain ethic or a certain set of intentions, but how, you know, who interprets it, with what's going on in the world at the moment of that person interpreting it, what art is being made at the time of the interpreting, all of those things are constantly in motion, and so the result is by definition always going to be different. And for me, the main change of kind of what GPS was when John was running it versus what it is now is, I guess, fairly straightforward in the sense that when John was running it, he's an artist himself, and his goal was, I'm an artist, I want to kind of model this behavior that as an artist, it's really important to show up for other artists and to find different ways in which other artists can kind of be there for each other and support each other. And so inherently those were kind of people that were in his community, or people not in his community that needed help, but that he was aware of. When he is not here anymore, maybe people don't know this, I am not an artist. So by definition, the person interpreting the score, there's a fundamental change right there, right? So all of a sudden, the question becomes, so for me, the prompt was, okay, well, John is not here to be the one kind of driving the car in terms of identifying what is the community that's being supported, what are the people that we're going to bring together, because he's not here. And so what to me struck me as a way to kind of move forward and interpret the score in a new way is saying, well, what's interesting about GPS is this notion of it's an artist who created an organization in order to support the work of other artists. And so let's continue doing that in the sense of all of our events, all of our LPs that we put out on the label, all of the grants that will be juried, that kind of lens that's deciding what should our audience look at and pay attention to will be determined by artists, poets, and musicians. So I essentially become an administrator, the prompt that we give to artists, poets, and musicians is to not necessarily feature their own work. I think New York has enough venues where artists, poets, and musicians can share with an audience the work that they're making. So in our context, it's really, would you be able, the invitation is to really share with an audience your interest in, engagement with, some relationship you might have with the work of someone else. And again, so it's not me choosing that content, but it's really trying to continue in a very different way than what John did it, because he chose everything himself. So in this new way of reading the score, it's me inviting a series of artists, poets, and musicians who in turn host an event where they, whether it's giving a lecture about another artist's work, whether it's curating a performance series of their work, whether it's editing an LP with various tracks of various people, whether it's hosting a dinner party salon where the topic of discussion is, you know, a poem by someone or a painting by someone. Whatever the formats might be, those are constantly kept. And then when we get to a place where we're able to start giving some grants out, then that also will be juried by a group of artists, poets, and musicians from the LGBT community, particularly, because that's another part of the history of the organization. So I guess there is definitely a, you know, going back to your question of kind of how does that mission evolve? I think in my case, it feels like it's very connected, but of course by necessity it's also very different.
And is it finding new audiences and new communities coming together, or do you feel like
it's finding? I mean, you know, the interest is, you know, that when you say, you know, do the people who were connected with GPS back in the day kind of come back? Yes and no. I mean, a lot of the people connected with the history are now filling amphitheaters. You know, I mean, Laurie Anderson is in town right now filling, I don't know what size of that venue is. We have maximum 120 capacity in our loft. And, you know, Laurie was on the board, gave several records, came out on GPS records with Laurie, Patti Smith, Sonic Youth. These are people that are not, you know, they're kind of a little bit, they're not going to necessarily perform. Although Elizabeth was at an event we did a few weeks ago with Patti Smith, which was a very special evening. But to get more, I think, and more an interesting part of that question is really my interest in making sure that this incredible history of all these incredible people that have been part of the story of GPS, that our hope today is to kind of leverage that history so that it benefits a new generation. So the program, what the content of the events are, what is going to be on the record label, who gets these grants, whose voices are recorded on the phone lines are a new generation. And so that they can benefit from the fact that there's a long history behind them of other incredible people that came before, but that the goal is really to be future facing. So hopefully, I mean, and we're seeing that. The events that we're doing are filled with lots of young people.
On the idea of future facing, I mean, I think the future is very much on the mind, at least it seems like it, for the work that you're doing, Elizabeth, with the foundation, that you're thinking about climate, you're thinking about young scholars, young curators coming up. Even the print donations are connected to like legacy, but also the future. But to that question of artists' wishes and where the artist's role is, would Helen Frankenthaler be jazzed for climate grants, or does it matter?
Well, I'm not sure she would be jazzed by climate grants, actually. And this was one of the very interesting things about your question and about our evolution. We had to take some decisions at certain points along the way about how to do things differently. And I mean, the climate grants, of course, would you know, in Helen's day, you know, aside from, you know, I guess like the late 60s, early 70s, people weren't really thinking about climate in the way they are now. I mean, it's an issue now, today, that we're all concerned about. We all feel like we need to do something about it, but it wouldn't have been germane to her interests or to her thinking. So we had to take the decision, do we do this? Why do we do this? And part of, you know, the answer to that question about why do we do it, that came about through another unforeseen event for all of us, which was COVID. And I mean, COVID changed so much for so many of us. For those of us in the foundation community, many of us had to like quickly shift our thinking about how to be supportive. And once we started doing that and supporting other organizations in a way that we hadn't done previously, along with many other foundations doing the same, it really changed our thinking. And we began to examine, like, how can we continue in this socially urgent vein in a way that is part of like a longer term horizon of thinking instead of just being reactive to a crisis. So that's something that obviously Helen Frankenthaler could never have, you know, thought about. But your question also makes me think of something else that's particular to our situation maybe, or to that of women artists of her generation. So Helen Frankenthaler never wanted to be positioned as a woman artist. She was against that, and I think that is typical of many of the artists of her generation. So, you know, again, an unforeseen occurrence was that several years after our foundation became active, there began to be a lot of interest in women artists and doing shows and publications devoted to women. So again, we had to stop and take a decision. And there was, you know, there were some folks involved with us that said, oh, Helen wouldn't have wanted that. You know, she wouldn't have wanted to be in a show of all women. But after some debate and discussion, we realized it was sort of unthinkable for such shows to take place without Frankenthaler's work included, and that we would be doing a disservice to her legacy if we didn't decide to do things differently than she would have done.
Yeah. I think that's a really dangerous trap of asking what would the artist do. You know, what would Andy do? It's been 40 years. That there's no proper way to do that is productive, really, even like appropriate in some way. I mean, there's a kind of like spirit that I think is true and carries through all of our foundations that are not really about the decisions day to day that an artist would have made, but there's a kind of act of conjuring that we're all doing to get that spirit forward. And it's in a very, I mean, maybe you would disagree, but it seems to me that all of the structures that have evolved around these artists are actually very reflective of their practice, of the way they made work, of their communities. And in a way, we are acting with that spirit and informed by it, but it's never what would this person think about this particular grant or this action that we take.
I mean, I think it's okay to acknowledge that, and I think that you should acknowledge it. Like, I always find that I'm bringing up this point in talking about, like, the women artist question, you know, that Helen Frankenthaler herself didn't, you know, care to be positioned that way, but so, like, I do feel it's important not to sweep her thoughts under the rug. I mean,
Yes,
that would be
yeah.
doing a disservice,
Yes,
you know,
no,
to her
I
legacy,
and I don't
too.
mean that, yeah.
But
yeah.
no, I know.
Yeah.
No, but just,
Can I just
Yeah.
add a point? I struggled a little bit with this because, you know, when I started working with the Baltrop estate and there was no name recognition, no market value, and no resources except for the work. And of course, one of the things that really became important, and it took about 5 years to get there, was to work with a gallery. And this was really something I had to take in mind because Alvin Baltrop had been so horribly rejected by the art world, and I have quotes from him about it. You know, being a large African American male, the subject matter that he was photographing was raw and real. It wasn't stylized the way Robert Mapplethorpe was, photographing beautiful black gay men. I mean, this was very different, and he encountered such really horrible resistance, not the word. He really had horrible encounters with the art world, and this is why he stopped even trying. That when I was, obviously I was wanting to work with the gallery, I really did have to keep in mind what kind of gallery it was. Mm-hmm. And I did have several galleries that pursued me, and they didn't feel right for different reasons. Not that they were racist or anything, but I could see that they were smelling commercial opportunity in the short term, and I waited. Took about 5 years, and I ended up working, and I'm very happy with this gallery, Gallery Buchholz, which is a German gallery that also has a gallery in New York, that really understood the work and was in there for the long term, and also the artists they work with are long-term relationships. You know, a lot of the photographs are not pristine, and all these other dealers wanted, immediately to conserve the work and make it look pristine, whereas, yes, that was, it's part of the work the way it looks. And so they really get it. But I did have that in the back of my mind as, not that I was like, would Alvin work with this gallery, but I was really trying to honor him in terms of what kind of gallery I ended up working with.
Yeah.
And it would have been easier for me financially to have gone with, there were some good galleries that are, the upper echelon.
Sure.
That wanted to work with me and, or have the work, and I didn't do it. So it is a fine line.
Yeah.
Because you don't know what the artist would do, and like you said, like you can't have a show of women artists from a certain period and not include Helen Frankenthaler. But I do think that is where whoever is in, making certain decisions has to have this kind of, I don't know, yeah, it's a certain kind of responsibility.
Yeah, or a sensibility. I mean,
And
you
sensibility,
need,
yeah.
yeah. Are there models that you've all seen out there of artist legacies that you would be excited about, that seem new to you, that are radical to you? Is there
Have you?
something? Huh?
Have you?
I mean,
I haven't seen anything radical myself that I can think of.
well, what we were talking about
Yeah.
earlier is that there's just so much work involved. There's a big hurdle to get to any of these places where you
Yeah.
can then give back and return to a
Yeah.
community or build. I mean, not every artist can do that, and
Yeah.
so the models that are there's some that are coming online, and I think we've mentioned some of the ones that I think are exciting. There's a lot of activity around this right now, and I think that and that is exciting to me. The fact that so many people are even thinking about legacy and thinking of it in a contemporary moment and in a way that is like really, again, responsive to their community or providing opportunities that are beyond philanthropic models that exist. Those things are out there.
I mean, I think one of the things that is interesting to observe and to have a couple of examples on this panel of artists that are still very much around and here that are doing significant work in this way of trying to create, whether it's a residency, whether it's a grant, whether it's opening a space like Mark Bradford or Laura Owens did here in LA also, where you kind of artists have a particular market share that they recognize that they have access to, and they are here to try to do something with that to benefit other artists or benefit others essentially. And I don't know enough about the history of this. Maybe you guys know more about. Was that the same case 40 years ago, 50 years ago? Still living artists starting to doing these kinds of things while they're living and doing the degree to which that we see now.
I do have to think a little bit, but I don't know if he would start it out as legacy, but I think Rick Lowe's Project Row Houses
Right.
is a project that is a legacy project, but I don't think it started out more as an extension of his practice.
Right.
That's a project that happened in that still exists in Houston. That was part artist residency, part housing for single teenage mothers, and then affected the entire third ward of Houston.
And continues to evolve and address
continues to
different
evolve,
needs that
yeah.
are happening there, yeah.
What I found also interesting is that there is a circular dynamic where the artists that found this kind of program is supporting artists, but also the artists that are benefiting from this program are also supporting other artists. I saw that at Black Rock, where we have a lot of different traditional practices, know-how, and the artists that come in residency really collaborate and work on the preservation, valorization of these different local practices, and imagine ways of sustainabilities for some of them, of also expanding the practice by bringing different technical challenges or different discourses. So, and at the same time, the artists that benefit from this exchange are also then giving, developing things for the artists that are in residency. So there is something very circular, and that creates a very strong, I think, strong system would say.
The system, yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Right words, but
well, and when legacies are then inspiring other legacies and going forward and just different ways of thinking about it. And as we said, like not every artist is at this level, obviously, or not every artist is in a position, but every artist is in a position to think about their legacy and to, by making work, it is in fact making a legacy, right? And there are very practical things out there that are helping artists to do that, one of which would be through the Joan Mitchell Foundation with Creating a Living Legacy, and there are others out there. So if you're thinking about that, that's one resource that exists for just some very practical, hands-on, this is how I organize my slides, this is how I get things prepared for exhibitions, this is how I identify what's going to happen next. And of course, there's so many aspects to this legacy. I mean, I'm even recognizing within the Warhol Foundation, I'm only speaking to one part of that. We have the catalog raisonné, we have licensing, we have the other departments that also are part of the Warhol legacy, not just the grants. But maybe in this, did you have something?
Well, I just wanted to also point out that, or just also, I think it's important to create space in the conversation for maybe also like, I think you and I share something of working with a legacy that is not a huge market share. You know, we talk a lot about these foundations and they all come from art, and even Mark Bradford and Laura Owens and Kehinde Wiley. I mean, there's a lot of other artists out there. And what I'm interested, I hope to see is I just want to make sure that in the conversation about this, that artists who are not have access to those kinds of markets are also think about this, and that there's ways to think about creating organizations, creating places, creating programs, creating something for your legacy, for others, and not necessarily linked to having the fact that your work is worth a lot of money.
I think that's cultural value.
I mean, John, he did this whole thing without, you know, raising money himself, writing grants, asking his friends to play concerts that would benefit things. I mean, there's ways to do it that, and you know, my hope is that what we can do is kind of model a behavior that potentially others can, you know, in most of the things I do, I always follow what I call the Velvet Underground rule, which is, you know, very few people saw them play live, but those who did went off to start a band. So, you know, it's not about necessarily filling the stadium, but you do something that then others can then take on, and that growth can happen in different ways. You don't have to start off with millions of dollars and as the only way to make something happen.
Yeah, I think there's also the potential to have some collective action around legacies too, where you're pooling resources of multiple artists and working from a community of artists to give back. So there's lots of things, but maybe in the spirit of collaboration, we should open things up to some questions to the audience.
Thank you so much. Oh, is it working? No. Thank you so much for being here. This is so fascinating and very exciting. And I wanted to ask a question about how do you balance all of the admin that you have to do, which I'm sure is extraordinary and complex, with the sustaining, facing forward, future-facing, and then this generative space, right, where you're actually creating opportunities. Maybe that's not the right word. You're creating space, you're creating silence or time for artists to connect or rest or make work or have a vision, be visionaries and create their own roots and branches to become sustaining angels for future artists and so on. How do you each balance? Because it's a lot.
Thank you for asking. I think we've never really thought about it. I think since the beginning it has been so exciting, like experience for us as well, the art workers, the people that are working there. It has been a driven force where we're just going, because it's so much transformative. but it's a lot. It's really a lot. But yeah, we decided for now to do it. I think after a moment, we need to find a way, because it's challenging to also expand the team a lot, to sustain with that. But so far we're doing it. We're good. But yeah, it will evolve.
I have found, because I wear many hats, and you know, the foundation, the state is not endowed, and blah blah blah. And I have found that when you have systems that really work, it's actually very liberatory because you have systems and they work, and then you can bring in other people and they fold in, and it just kind of helps keep things on track. You just have to, in my experience, it's when resources are limited for the different projects, this also goes for Denniston Hill, is, you keep a very realistic outlook on what's possible, and you just have really good systems. Because then you don't have to spend your time figuring things out when there's a good system in place. So it's pretty simple in some ways. I wish it was more creative answer, but I found, having tried a lot of different ways, that having really good systems works the best.
I guess I don't really see it as that different than, I think some of us come from a background of working in museums or in other, and the same question, I mean, it's exactly the same thing. As a museum curator, how do you find time to curate shows when most of your time is spent Excel budget forecasting and, donor cultivation and, managing others? And I think it's that question, I think, is relevant for everything.
I would just add to that, we don't run a residency program, so we don't have that level of activity. But for us, it's been the incremental growth of our organization has made it possible to do more and more.
I was very surprised in a very positive way to hear that foundations support even museums, and being a patron of several museums, museums always want more money and more donations and so on. So how can an organization, a foundation, can support the museum and all those programs? That's kind of fascinating to hear.
How do we do it? Yeah, well, we write the check. They do it. I mean, for us, they propose the same way anybody else would. Yeah. They write smaller checks. Or they don't. I mean, that might not be part of their program, or their giving might not be museums. They could focus on smaller things. We made the choice within the foundation to support all stratas of artistic activity, from things that are very, very small in people's garages to the Hammer Museum, and well, there's nothing above that. So, but I mean the full range, right? And there are some gaps in there, but they tend to be on the smaller side of things, where we're trying to figure out how to support those organizations. But the museums, I mean, we support scholarly exhibitions, we support the catalogs, and anytime they're doing a show, whether that's emerging artists or artists who have not been seen or haven't been given the attention that they might deserve, we like to come in and support those things wherever that's happening.
No, that's admirable, and it was actually nice to hear, because I wasn't aware of that.
Oh, well, good.
Can I ask James what was there a decision at some point? It seems like there was a decision at some point that the Warhol Foundation would not ever do its own programming.
Oh yeah, that's somewhat intentional. Yeah. Not somewhat, it's intentional. because we're interested in supporting things that are radical, experimental, hard to fundraise for, things that might be at the margins, Andy doesn't really need our help in any of those things. Like there's enough Andy shows out there. So the fact was, we donated a lot to the museum to get that started in Pittsburgh. We continually support the museum that's out there. But in terms of our own grant-making program, we will give to all the other artists that don't have the exposure that Andy had, and try to support that.
And also there is different form of support, aside financial support, and there is a question that I'm asking more and more is the relation between residency program and museum, because residency is a place of creation, production of knowledge. How is that document preserved? How can that also constitute like a archive for next generation, for educational intention? And museums are a place of preservation, a place that welcome the public. So I think there is more things to weave in these two artistic organization, like form a shape to constitute like resourceful and sustainable, like impact, I would say.
Other questions out there?
Hello, thank you everybody for your time. I just was curious in terms of nonprofit models. I know maybe Yona, the trust maybe is not a nonprofit, but for all of you, do you find that you're pushing against what a nonprofit can accomplish or what the rules and restrictions might be from a legal basis versus maybe what other models could accomplish and what your considerations are there and how that might affect how you proceed in the future?
Melissa's a lawyer, so be careful about how you answer this question.
Yeah, I'm not.
Well, I mean, we, like probably all the rest here, are 501c3 organizations, yes? Oh, no, you're not, right, because you're a trust, I mean, in our case, we, find the parameters of that, the rules and regulations to be fine, adequate. We are, I should say, we are well-resourced, so, we're very, careful about like making sure that we spend, the right amount of money that's mandated to be spent under, the requirements of private foundations. And yeah, no, I mean, it doesn't seem to be an issue.
I mean, Melissa actually taught me the difference between private foundation, which I guess you are, and we are not. We are a public charity because you have to pass the test of as long as your funding sources come from a diverse range of places. If it all comes from one place, you're a private foundation, which is still a 501c3 tax-exempt organization, but the funding all comes from one place. Public charity, 501c3 organization, where your support comes from a range of different places. And so in our case is the category that we fall into. Yeah, the rules and regulations are a little bit less strict in our case.
Yeah, you just have to prove that you have, I think, a little over a third of your income coming from diverse sources.
Is there another question?
Can you explain if it's a trust that you have as a background? How, is it funded well, or how is it funded? Where does the money come from?
Does
that make sense?
Yeah. So, my case, there was no money. Yeah. There was just a will to establish a trust, and the only assets were the actual work, not even real estate. He rented his apartment. There was really no money, and that's why it's kind of crazy that I took it on because I put in a lot of my own resources. And even, right now, because he didn't show his work during his lifetime, except for like some bars he used to go to, he only printed about 1,000 prints, and there's over 30,000 negatives. And right now, and negatives have a limited lifespan, and right now, and I'm in the process of fundraising. It's about $300,000 to not just digitize the negatives, but create like content sheets of the negatives so it can be available for research, create positives of the negatives, because it might tell a very different story when we look at the other 29,000 images that nobody's ever seen about his work.
He was just really into still life. He had nothing to do with any of the other.
Right, yeah. I mean, he's now
mostly
very much
Pontiacs,
associated with the Piers and Pier 52 particularly, and, the whole scene that was happening there. But there's, he also documented, the black choreographers in Harlem. A lot of these choreographers are still not very well known. He was part of that scene too. So there's this is the case that I make when I talk to funders is this is not just about Baltrop's work, this is about a particular history of New York that he documented that really nobody else did. So no, there was no money. Yes, I did believe in his work, and I was kind of blown away by his work, and I couldn't believe that nobody had Yeah, and it's a little bit like adopting a kid, to be honest, because it comes with a lot of responsibilities. Yeah.
And that's true of all the foundations and organizations up here, is that like passion, I think, that you're talking about happens at some point in the process of this, where somebody has to see it enough and be passionate enough about the work and the artist to put in the incredible amount of work and resources that it takes to develop something, both large and small. But that passion has to be there. Do we have time for one more?
Would you care to share any comments on more like the Theastergates model, which seems to be much more muddled between work, commerce, legacy, and whatever else gets thrown into it? I'm an outsider, so I don't know anything about all the artists and the foundation.
I mean, it seems like a pretty successful model would be my comment on that. I mean, it's balancing the commercial side of it with a real, I think, sincere effort to support the community. So,
and it comes with, I mean, he is particularly well placed to make enormous impact. I mean, not only does he have the resources to do so, but he's a, trained urban planner who knows everyone on the city government in that part of Chicago, and is able to really make inroads in being able to talk about, understand how do you make a neighborhood succeed. And he kind of, on a kind of city planning level, civil engineering level, he really knows what he's doing. And so that combination of both being an artist and having the ability to, and the resources to, but also wanting to kind of make a neighborhood. I mean, the Astor, as you know, has not just one building, but has a whole campus of buildings in that part of Chicago, and he's really able to make an entire ecosystem there. And I think but I think to your point of combining, I don't know if the bookshop is still going, but combining all kinds of different models, whether it's a shop, whether it's an archive, whether it's an exhibition space or a studio, his own studio.
and part of that is also training the next generation of leaders and administrators that you're talking about to come in with that as a solid example and to move up through the ranks. I mean, we see that all the time in the grants that we make. It's seeding the field or something. Like, it's really inspiring. But I think that probably brings us to a really nice close. We'll leave on inspiring as the word for everything. I want to thank everybody, all the panelists up here, and thank you. Thanks to Hannah. And we'll just be around if you have more questions for us.
Thank you, team.
Thank you.